19. That is the number that should haunt you tonight. It is not the number of soldiers fallen in a great battle, nor the count of gold coins in a treasury. It is the number of wooden boxes carried out of the Topkapi Palace gates in the freezing dawn of January 28th, 1595. 19 small coffins. Some were large enough for grown men, but most were pitifully short. Some were so small they looked like cradles carved from cypress wood. Inside them lay the bodies of 19 princes of the Ottoman Empire. They were not enemies of the state. They were brothers. And hours before, many of them had been asleep in their mother's arms, their mouths still smelling of milk. They did not die by the sword, for the laws of the empire forbade the spilling of royal blood upon the ground. No, their end was silent. It came with the soft, terrifying hiss of a silk bowstring tightening around a throat. It was clean. It was bloodless. It was absolute. This was the price of a new sultan's ascension. And as the procession of death moved silently through the courtyard, a pair of eyes watched from behind a high, latticed window. They were not the eyes of a grieving widow, nor a frightened concubine. They were the eyes of a mother. Safiye Sultan stood in the shadows, her fingers tracing the embroidery of a handkerchief stiff with gold thread. She did not look away. She did not weep. In the silence of that winter morning, she understood a truth that we are terrified to admit even today. Sometimes, to keep a crown, you must first bury your heart. The world outside these walls believes the Ottoman Harem was a paradise of pleasure, a garden of earthly delights where beautiful women lounged on velvet cushions waiting to be chosen. You have seen the paintings. You have heard the stories. But those are lies painted by men who never set foot inside the seraglio. The truth is far colder and infinitely more fascinating. This was not a brothel. It was the most dangerous political academy on earth. It was a place where a woman's beauty was merely a weapon, sharp as a dagger, but her mind was the hand that wielded it. The air here did not smell of roses and romance. It smelled of fear, masked by heavy musk and ambergris. It smelled of the iron tang of unspoken threats. For centuries, historians have focused on the sultans, the bearded men who sat upon the throne. But if you look closer, into the shadows behind the throne, you will see the silhouette of a woman. This was the era of the Sultanate of Women, a time when the most powerful ruler of one of history's greatest empires was not the man wearing the turban, but the woman wearing the veil. Safiye Sultan, watching those 19 coffins disappear into the mist of the Bosphorus, was not merely a spectator to history. She was its architect. She knew that in this golden cage, there were only two positions available to a woman: the player or the pawn. And pawns were sacrificed. Pawns were strangled in the night. Pawns were sewn into weighted sacks and dropped into the dark waters below the palace walls. She had chosen to be the player. As the morning call to prayer echoed over the city, drowning out the faint sounds of the funeral procession, the harem woke up to a new reality. The old order was dead. The new sultan, her son Mehmed, sat on the throne. But everyone knew whose hand truly gripped the scepter. The fratricide that morning was not a tragedy in her eyes. It was a necessity. It was a statistical adjustment. It was the brutal mathematics of survival in a world where power is a zero-sum game. To understand why a mother would sanction the murder of children, we must strip away our modern morality and step onto the cold marble floors of the Topkapi. We must walk past the eunuchs standing guard with their tongues cut out, past the golden cages of the princes, and into the private chambers of the Valide Sultan. Here, love is a weakness, and mercy is a death sentence. Here, the only thing thicker than blood is the desire to rule. But before we condemn the executioner, we must weep for the condemned. It is easy to look at those 19 small coffins and see only a massacre. But to the people of that time, this was a gruesome form of mercy. There existed a law in the Ottoman Code, written by Mehmet the Conqueror a century prior, a law that was whispered in the corridors like a curse. It stated simply, "For the welfare of the state, the one of my sons to whom God grants the Sultanate may lawfully put his brothers to death." It was a brutal calculus, a primal truth etched into the very stones of the empire. They believed it was better for a dozen princes to die by the strangler's cord than for thousands of soldiers to die in a civil war. They weighed the blood of a child against the stability of the realm, and the realm always won. And so, the harem became a factory of tragedy, a place where a mother prayed for her son to be sultan, not just for glory, but because it was the only way to ensure he stayed alive. To lose the throne was not to fade into obscurity, it was to cease to exist. Imagine, if you can, growing up in the shadow of this impending doom. The life of an Ottoman prince was a paradox of extreme luxury and absolute terror. They called their living quarters the coffins, or the cage. It was not a dungeon with dripping walls and rats scuttling in the corners. It was a suite of opulent rooms lined with Iznik tiles the color of the Aegean Sea, filled with soft divans and the scent of burning sandalwood. But it was a prison nonetheless. The windows were high and barred, allowing only a slice of the sky to be seen. The doors were guarded by men who could not speak, the mute eunuchs who served as both servants and jailers. A prince inside the cage might live his entire life without ever seeing a woman other than his mother, without ever stepping foot in a market, without ever riding a horse across an open plain. He was a bird fed on golden grain, fattened and kept pristine, waiting for the day the master would decide if he was to be the showpiece or the sacrifice. Think of the psychological torture of such an existence. Every meal placed before you might be your last, laced with arsenic or ground glass. Every footstep in the corridor at night might be the BOWSTRING, the imperial gardeners who doubled as executioners, coming to harvest the royal crop. These princes were not strangers to one another. They played together in the courtyards as toddlers. They shared tutors. They shared blood. And yet, they grew up looking at their brothers and seeing not a playmate, but a rival who might one day order their death. Or worse, a victim they would have to order killed. This was the air they breathed. It poisoned their minds long before any toxic powder touched their lips. It bred paranoia. It bred madness. And for the mothers watching from the sidelines, it bred a ferocity that defied nature. When a Valide Sultan maneuvered, when she bribed a vizier or forged an alliance, she was not just fighting for power. She was fighting the executioner standing at her son's door. She was a tigress backed into a corner, baring her teeth at the world. So when we speak of the Sultanate of Women, do not imagine frivolous ladies playing at politics. Imagine desperate survivors, operating a machine that was designed to crush them. The 19 princes who died that winter morning were the waste product of this machine. They were the collateral damage of a system that demanded absolute unity at the cost of absolute humanity. Their silence is the foundation upon which the Valide Sultan stood. And as the last coffin was lowered into the earth, the question was no longer about who had died. The question was about who had survived and what she was willing to do to ensure that the bowstring never came for her again. The game had changed, and the women of the harem had learned that in the Ottoman court, you do not wait for destiny to decide your fate. You grab destiny by the throat and squeeze until it submits. But who were they really, these women who dared to grab destiny by the throat? If you look for their names in the birth registries of the noble houses of Europe, you will find nothing. If you search for their lineage in the royal archives of the East, the pages are blank. That is because the most powerful women in the history of the Islamic world began their lives as nobodies. They were not born, they were made. They were stolen. Picture a village in the mountains of the Caucasus, or a small island in the Venetian lagoon. A raid in the middle of the night. Smoke, screams. A young girl, perhaps 12 or 13, is dragged from her bed by Tartar raiders. She is shackled, marched across dusty plains for weeks, and sold in a slave market in Crimea. She is stripped naked, inspected like livestock, her teeth checked for rot, her skin checked for blemishes. She is a commodity. And when she is finally bought for the Sultan's household, the first thing they take from her is her name. Her past is erased. Her religion is stripped away. She is given a new Persian name, Hurrem, Nurbanu, Kösem, names that mean the laughing one or the queen of light. Cruel poetic labels for a girl who has lost everything. She enters the harem at the very bottom of the food chain, a Carriage, the lowest rank of slave. She sleeps in a dormitory with 100 other girls, learning to sew, to play the lute, to recite poetry, and to please a man she has never met. She is property. She belongs to the Sultan, body and soul. But here lies the greatest irony of the Ottoman Empire. The slave became the master. These women, stripped of their identity, realized that while they had no rights, they had opportunity. If they could catch the Sultan's eye, if they could bear him a son, they would cease to be slaves. They would become the mothers of the dynasty. They would become the Valide. It is a rise to power that has no parallel in history. Imagine a slave girl who once scrubbed floors, rising to dictate foreign policy to the Queen of England. Imagine a woman who was once sold for a few silver coins, commanding an army of janissaries. It is an intoxicating story of triumph, but it came at a terrible cost. To survive the climb, they had to shed their innocence, along with their old names. They had to learn to poison a rival's sherbet without their hand trembling. They had to learn to look into the eyes of a crying child and see a threat to the throne. They had to become harder than the diamonds they wore around their necks. And this brings us to the heart of our journey together. As we peel back the layers of gold leaf and velvet to reveal the blood-stained history of the Sultanate of Women, you will find yourself torn. It is easy to judge them from the safety of the present. It is easy to call them cruel. But history is rarely black and white. It is painted in shades of gray and dried blood. We are about to walk through the corridors of their lives, witnessing acts of supreme sacrifice and acts of unspeakable horror. We will see them build mosques and soup kitchens to feed the poor, and we will see them sign death warrants for their own kin. You will see them as brilliant politicians holding a crumbling empire together, and as ruthless tyrants who would burn the world to keep their sons warm. So before we step further into the shadows of the Topkapi, I need you to prepare your verdict. Listen closely to the whispers behind the lattice screens. Look at the evidence we will lay out before you. The letters, the ledgers, the corpses. And then you must decide. Are these women monstrous manipulators? Power-hungry witches who corrupted the state for their own vanity? Or are they the ultimate victims? Desperate mothers trapped in a gilded cage, forced to become monsters just to survive a game they never asked to play. The line between a villain and a survivor is often just a matter of who tells the story. But tonight, you are the judge. And in the harem, the verdict is never simple. To understand the crime, we must first understand the scene of the crime. When Western travelers wrote about the Ottoman Empire, their pens dripped with envy and fantasy. They painted the harem as a decadent playground, a place of soft flesh and opium dreams, where women did nothing but bathe in rosewater and wait for the Sultan's touch. These are the harem Ottoman dark secrets that the world wants to believe. Titillating, exotic, and fundamentally wrong. Erase those paintings from your mind. The imperial harem was not a brothel. It was a fortress. It was a convent, a university, and a military barracks all rolled into one, concealed behind the heavy iron gate of felicity. If you stood before that gate today, you would feel the weight of the silence. It was a world within a world, governed by a rigid hierarchy that would make a modern corporation look chaotic. At the bottom were the achemi, the novices, young girls scrubbing laundry in freezing water, their hands raw and red. At the top sat the Valide Sultan, a queen mother who wielded more influence than any European monarch. And in between lay a minefield of protocol, etiquette, and ruthless ambition. Life inside these walls was defined by discipline, not debauchery. A girl entering the harem was subjected to a rigorous education that rivaled that of the princes. She learned to read the Quran, to write elegant Ottoman Turkish, to play the oud, and to converse with wit and subtlety. She was trained in the art of silence. She learned to walk without making a sound, to speak only when spoken to, and to lower her gaze before her superiors. A single misstep, a voice raised too loud, or a plate dropped at dinner could result in a beating by the kalfas, the harsh taskmistresses who ran the daily operations with iron rods. This was a meritocracy of the cruelest kind. Beauty might get you through the door, but only intelligence kept you alive. The goal was not just to share the Sultan's bed. That was merely the first step. The goal was to become a haseki, a favorite, and ultimately to bear a son. A son was the only key that could unlock the door to true Valide Sultan power. Without a son, a woman was merely a decorative object, easily discarded when her beauty faded or the Sultan grew bored. With a son, she became a dynasty. But who kept order in this house of women? It was not the Sultan. He was merely a visitor in his own home. The true enforcers were the eunuchs. Specifically, the chief black eunuch, the Kislar Aga. He was the bridge between the harem and the outside world, the only man allowed to enter the private quarters of the women. He was a figure of immense, terrifying power, often kidnapped from Sudan or Ethiopia as a child, and mutilated to ensure his loyalty lay only with the throne. He controlled the communications. He controlled the discipline. And most importantly, he controlled access to the Sultan. If a Valide Sultan wanted to send a message to the Grand Vizier, she went through him. If a concubine wanted to beg for a favor, she went through him. The Kislar Aga and the Valide Sultan formed a dark alliance, a twin-headed snake that coiled around the heart of the empire. They knew every secret. They heard every whisper. And together, they ensured that the harem remained a sealed ecosystem where outside laws did not apply. This was the machine into which our protagonists were thrown. It was a place where harem Ottoman dark secrets were not about illicit affairs, but about political assassinations disguised as accidents. It was a place where a cup of coffee could stop a heart, and a loose floorboard could hide a stash of gold coins meant for a bribe. To survive here required a specific kind of genius. You had to be patient enough to wait years for a single opportunity, and ruthless enough to destroy anyone who stood in your way when that moment arrived. It is in this high-pressure cooker that the concept of the Sultanate of Women was forged. It was not a feminist revolution. It was a hostile takeover. As the sultans became increasingly secluded and disengaged, preferring the pleasures of the hunt or the bottle, a power vacuum opened up. And nature, as we know, abhors a vacuum. The women of the harem, trained in the arts of survival and manipulation, stepped into the void. They did not just influence the state, they became the state. And the first among them, the woman who wrote the rulebook on how to rule from the shadows, was a Venetian girl named Nurbanu. She was the architect of the era, the first woman to truly rise from the dust of the slave market to the dizzying heights of the Regency. History knows her as Nurbanu Sultan, the Queen of Light. But long before the heavy doors of the Topkapi closed behind her, she may have been Cecilia Veneer Baffo. Legend and diplomatic whispers insist she was a noblewoman of Venice, captured during a raid on the island of Paros by the terrifying Admiral Barbarossa. Imagine the psychological shift required. One day, you are the daughter of a patrician, draped in the finest Italian lace, expecting a marriage alliance with a duke. The next, you are cargo in the hold of a galley, destined for a heathen court. But Nurbanu possessed a weapon far more potent than her lineage. She had a mind that operated like a chessboard. She did not weep for her lost life. She assessed her new one. She understood quickly that in the Ottoman court, power was not given, it was seized. And she found her vessel in Prince Selim. Selim was not a warrior like his father, Suleiman the Magnificent. He was not a statesman. History remembers him unkindly as Selim the Sot, or Selim the Drunkard. He was a man who preferred the ruby depths of a wine goblet to the dusty campaigns of war. He was soft, pliable, and disinterested in the grinding gears of governance. To a lesser woman, being paired with such a man would have been a curse. To Nurbanu, it was a gift from God. She saw exactly what he was, a vacuum waiting to be filled. While Selim drank his way into oblivion, Nurbanu quietly picked up the reins of the state. She did not nag him, she enabled him. She created a world of comfort around him, isolating him with pleasures, so that she could deal with the pashas, the admirals, and the viziers. She became the gatekeeper. No one saw the Sultan without seeing Nurbanu first. In the shadows of the imperial apartments, she was the one reading the dispatches from the front lines. She was the one dictating the responses. The empire believed it was ruled by a sultan. In reality, it was ruled by a partnership where the man provided the legitimacy and the woman provided the brain. Her ambition was not limited to the domestic sphere. Nurbanu Sultan looked outward, past the minarets of Istanbul, towards the courts of Europe. She understood the language of power on a global scale. We have the letters to prove it, tangible, physical evidence of her reach. She struck up a correspondence with another formidable woman of her age, Catherine de' Medici, the Queen Mother of France. Think of the audacity of this. A former slave writing to a queen as an equal. And she was accepted as an equal. In their letters, which still exist in dusty archives today, they did not just exchange pleasantries, they traded influence. They discussed commercial treaties and the balance of power in the Mediterranean. They exchanged gifts that were symbols of their intimacy and status. Nurbanu sent Catherine rare lapdogs from the East. Catherine sent Nurbanu high-quality cosmetics and fine paper from Paris. It is a fascinating, almost humanizing detail amidst the grand politics. Two of the most powerful women on earth, separated by religion and thousands of miles, bonding over the difficulties of ruling a world made for men, while exchanging beauty tips. But do not mistake this for softness. This network was a tool. Nurbanu used her Venetian heritage and her French connections to steer Ottoman foreign policy away from war with Venice, preserving trade routes that made both empires rich. She was playing 4D chess while the men around her were playing checkers. She proved that a woman in the harem could be more than a breeder of heirs. She could be a diplomat of the highest order. But intelligence in the harem is a dangerous thing. It breeds jealousy. It breeds enemies. And as Nurbanu's grip on the empire tightened, she knew that the greatest threat to her power was not a foreign army, but the mortality of the man she controlled. Selim was drinking himself to death, and when he fell, the ground beneath her feet would crumble. She needed a plan. And what she did next would go down as one of the most macabre and brilliant acts of political survival in human history. It happened on a cold day in December, 1574. Sultan Selim II, the man who held the title of Caliph of the Faithful, slipped on the wet marble floor of a bathhouse. Some say he was chasing a concubine. Others say he was dizzy from wine. It matters little how he fell. What matters is that he did not get up. He struck his head, suffered a hemorrhage, and died. In any other kingdom, the death of a monarch triggers the ringing of bells, the tearing of clothes, and the immediate proclamation of a successor. But in the Ottoman Empire, the death of a sultan was the most dangerous moment in the life of the state. It was a vacuum that invited chaos. If the Janissaries found out the throne was empty before the new sultan arrived to pay their accession bonus, they would riot. They would burn the city to the ground. And Nurbanu's son, Prince Murad, was far away in Manisa, days of hard riding from the capital. If news leaked, rival factions could seize the treasury, or worse, put a different prince on the throne. Nurbanu looked at the cooling body of her husband and made a decision that chills the blood. She decided that Sultan Selim was not dead. Not yet. For 12 agonizing days, Nurbanu Sultan staged the greatest deception in Ottoman history. She ordered the body of the Sultan to be carried into a private chamber, claiming he was merely ill and required absolute rest. But a body, stripped of life, begins to betray its secret quickly. The smell of decay is a traitor that no amount of musk can silence. So she ordered ice, tons of it. Ice brought down from the mountains, ostensibly to cool the fevered sultan's sherbet. In reality, it was packed around his corpse in a wooden box, creating a makeshift coffin of frost within the warm heart of the palace. Picture the scene. Outside the heavy oak doors, the palace hummed with life. Viziers waited with petitions, musicians tuned their instruments, and cooks prepared elaborate feasts for a master who could no longer eat. Inside, in the dim light of oil lamps, Nurbanu sat vigil next to a rotting corpse packed in ice. She was the only thing standing between the empire and civil war. Every day was a high-wire act of theatrical improvisation. She allowed doctors to enter the room, but only those she had bribed or threatened into silence. She had food brought to the door on silver platters, and then had the empty plates returned later, as if the Sultan had enjoyed his meal. She even had musicians play soft melodies in the corridor, telling them the Sultan needed soothing music to ease his headache. Imagine the nerves of steel required to maintain this charade. One slip, one servant noticing the stench, one whisper to the Janissaries, and she would have been torn apart. But she did not flinch. She sat in that cold room, listening to the rhythmic dripping of melting ice, counting the hours until her son could reach the capital. This is the definition of Valide Sultan power. It is not just about giving orders. It is about enduring the gruesome reality of politics. It is about holding the hand of a dead husband while plotting the ascension of a living son. Finally, late one night, a signal came from the Bosphorus. A galley had arrived from Manisa. Prince Murad was here. Only then, when her son walked through the gates of the Topkapi and the Janissaries saw their new master, did Nurbanu allow the truth to be spoken. The ice was removed. The death was announced. The reign of Selim ended, and the reign of Murad III began. But in truth, the reign that truly began that day was that of Nurbanu herself as the official Valide Sultan. She had literally preserved the dynasty on ice. She had proven that she could defy even death to ensure the transfer of power. And as her son ascended the throne, he knew, and the entire court knew, that he owed his crown not to the will of Allah alone, but to the terrifying competence of his mother. Yet as one queen mother secured her legacy, another was waiting in the wings, watching, learning, and preparing to take the game of influence to a level that even Nurbanu could not imagine. Her name was Safiye, and she would soon teach the empire that while Nurbanu had controlled the state, she intended to own it. If Nurbanu was the master of the shadows, Safiye was the mistress of the spotlight. She understood a fundamental truth about the Ottoman Empire that others missed. In a state built on war, the ultimate weapon is not steel, but gold. And Safiye had more gold than God. While the Sultan was paid a salary of 1,000 aspers a day, and the Grand Vizier, the man technically running the empire, received perhaps 500, Safiye Sultan commanded a daily stipend of 3,000 aspers. Let that number sink in. She was earning 3 times the salary of the emperor himself. It was an obscene amount of wealth, a river of silver flowing directly into her private coffers. But she did not hoard it under her mattress. She used it to build a network of loyalty that penetrated every corner of the capital. She bribed judges. She bought janissary officers. She paid poets to sing her praises and clerics to bless her name. She turned the harem into a central bank, and everyone, from the lowest gardener to the highest pasha, was in her debt. But nothing symbolizes her audacity quite like the carriage. It was a gift from her distant correspondent, Queen Elizabeth I of England. Imagine the scene in the narrow, twisting streets of Constantinople in the late 16th century. The people were used to seeing horses, camels, and modest curtained litters. They were not used to seeing a gaudy, gilded European carriage with glass windows rattling over the cobblestones like a chariot of the sun. And inside sat Safiye Sultan. By tradition, the women of the Sultan were sacred, invisible creatures. When they traveled, they did so in covered wagons or boats, strictly shielded from the gaze of common men. But Safiye broke the seal. She rode through the city in her English carriage, the velvet curtains pulled back just enough for the world to see the flash of her emeralds. It was a scandal. It was a deliberate provocation. The conservative religious leaders, the muftis, frothed at the mouth. They called it the vehicle of the infidel. They preached fiery sermons condemning her vanity, warning that a woman who mimics the West brings ruin to the East. But Safiye did not care. She wanted them to see her. She wanted them to know that the hand rocking the cradle was also the hand holding the whip. This carriage was more than a mode of transport. It was a mobile throne. It represented a tectonic shift in the history of the Sultanate of Women. Power was no longer just about survival. It was about display. It was about dominance. Safiye corresponded directly with foreign courts, bypassing the viziers entirely. Her letters to Elizabeth were written on paper dusted with gold powder, sealed with her own imperial tuhra, discussing the movement of fleets and the suppression of piracy as if she were the admiral of the sea. She was the Valide Sultan who dared to step out of the dark and into the blinding light of public life. But in doing so, she painted a target on her back. The people marveled at her wealth, but they began to resent her influence. They saw the poverty in the streets, the devaluation of the currency, and then they saw the golden carriage rolling by. The seeds of anger were being sown, seeds that would one day blossom into a bloody harvest. But for now, Safiye rode on, protected by her walls of gold, unaware that the era of untouchable queens was slowly, inevitably, approaching its violent climax. But gold, as shiny as it is, has a limited reach. To truly control an empire of men, you need a currency that appeals to their basest instincts. And the Valide Sultans were the grand bankers of a very different kind of economy. We must talk about the mechanism of corruption that slowly began to rot the foundations of the Ottoman state. A mechanism with a deceptively innocent name, pashmakluk, or slipper money. In theory, this was a traditional allowance granted to imperial women to cover the cost of their footwear and clothing. It sounds quaint, doesn't it? A few coins for silk slippers. In reality, pashmaklik evolved into a massive diversion of state revenue. Entire provinces, the tax yields of fertile islands in the Aegean, and the customs duties of bustling ports were signed over to the Valide Sultan under this guise. When a peasant in Anatolia broke his back harvesting wheat, the profit did not go to the treasury to pay the soldiers. It went into the velvet purse of the Queen Mother. But land was just the beginning. The real money was in the selling of office. Under the Sultanate of Women, the meritocracy that had built the empire was replaced by a kleptocracy. You want to be the governor of Damascus? You do not need to be a skilled administrator. You need to send a chest of rubies to the Valide Sultan. You want to be the admiral of the fleet? You do not need to know how to sail. You need to promise her a percentage of your plunder. The harem became a grand auction house. Offices were sold to the highest bidder, and incompetent men filled positions of power simply because they had paid their slipper money. The empire was being eaten from the inside out by greed, and the spoon feeding the beast was held by a woman's manicured hand. However, the darkest form of currency was not gold, nor land, nor rubies. It was flesh. The harem was filled with hundreds of beautiful, highly educated women who would never make it to the Sultan's bed. In a brilliant and cynical twist, the Valide Sultans turned these surplus women into human listening devices. They would arrange marriages between these loyal concubines and the powerful pashas and viziers of the court. To a rising politician, this looked like a supreme honor. To be given a wife from the imperial household was a sign of ultimate favor. But he was inviting a spy into his bed. These women, trained from childhood to be absolutely loyal to their valide, acted as her eyes and ears in the bedrooms of the elite. Imagine the scene. A powerful Grand Vizier returns home after a secret meeting where he plots against the Queen Mother. He lies down with his beautiful wife, perhaps whispering his frustrations in the dark, thinking he is safe in the sanctity of his marriage. He does not know that every word he speaks, every name he drops, every hesitation in his voice will be reported back to the Topkapi the next morning. The Valide Sultan did not just control the state through laws. She controlled it through the pillow talk of her enemies. She weaponized intimacy. She turned the sanctity of marriage into a surveillance state. The pashas were trapped in a web of silk, married to women they dared not divorce and could not trust. It was a masterclass in psychological domination. The Valide Sultan owned them. She owned their careers through bribery, and she owned their private lives through her daughters. It was a system of control so total, so pervasive, and so perversely effective that it is a miracle the empire didn't collapse sooner. But as the corruption spread like gangrene, a new player was about to enter the stage. A woman who would inherit this rotting machine and push it to its absolute bloody limit. Her name was Kösem. If Nurbanu was the dawn of this era, and Safiye was its blinding high noon, then Kösem Sultan was its long, enduring twilight. She is, without question, the most powerful woman to ever breathe the air of the Ottoman court. Her name evokes a mixture of reverence and terror that no other figure can command. She was not content to merely pull strings from the shadows. She stepped forward and cut the strings entirely, holding the puppet herself. Born Anastasia on the windswept Greek island of Tinos, the daughter of a priest, she was washed onto the shores of the harem like so many others. But Anastasia possessed a quality that transcended mere cunning. She had gravity. She had the kind of presence that could suck the oxygen out of a room. When she became Kösem, the leader of the herd, she did not just marry a sultan, she married the empire. And when her husband, Ahmed I, died young, leaving behind a chaotic nursery of potential heirs, Kösem did something unprecedented. She shattered the glass ceiling of the Islamic world. She assumed the title of Naib-e-Sultanate, Regent of the Sultanate. Before her, women wielded power unofficially, through whispers and pillow talk. Kösem made it official. She was the first woman to legally rule the Ottoman Empire. Imagine the scene in the divan, the imperial council chamber. The most powerful men in the world, bearded viziers, scarred generals, learned judges, gathered to discuss the fate of nations. And presiding over them was not a man, but a curtain. The kafes-i-mushebbek, a latticed window high in the wall. Behind that screen sat Kösem. They could not see her face, but they could hear her voice, sharp and clear, cutting through their hesitation. When she spoke, the Grand Vizier bowed to a blank wall. When she commanded an army to march to Baghdad or a fleet to sail to Crete, the order came from a woman hidden in silk. She was the ghost in the machine, the invisible hand that signed the treaties and balanced the budget. For nearly 30 years, through the reigns of her sons and grandson, she was the Padishah in all but name. She was the one who woke up at dawn to read the intelligence reports from the spies. She was the one who met with the unruly Janissary Corps, standing alone before thousands of armed men to negotiate their loyalty, calming their rage with a mix of maternal sternness and cold, hard cash. While her son, the ferocious Murad IV, was out conquering cities and severing heads, Kösem was in the capital, ensuring there was bread in the markets and coin in the treasury. She was the anchor, keeping the ship from drifting into the storm. But absolute power is a heavy cloak to wear. It isolates you. To rule as a Naibi Sultanate meant she had to suppress every maternal instinct she possessed. She could not afford to be a mother first. She had to be the state first, and the state is a cruel master. It demanded that she look at her own children not with love, but with calculation. Were they strong enough? Were they sane enough? And if they were not, what then? This was the tragic burden of Kösem Sultan. She was the guardian of the dynasty. But to save the tree, she would eventually be forced to prune its branches. She ruled with a brilliance that rivaled Elizabeth of England or Catherine the Great of Russia. Yet she is often remembered only for her end. But before the blood and the betrayal, there was the glory. There was a time when a Greek priest's daughter held the entire Islamic world in the palm of her hand, and for a brief, shining moment, the Sultanate of Women was not a slur, but a testament to the fact that when the world of men fell into chaos, it took a woman to restore order. But order is a fragile thing, especially when it rests on the shoulders of a madman. And Kösem's tragedy was that after years of steering the empire through storms, she found herself trapped in a nightmare of her own making. Her son, Ibrahim, ascended the throne not as a conqueror, but as a broken soul. For 22 years, he had lived in the cage, every day expecting the executioner to open the door. He had watched his brothers die, one by one. The terror had hollowed him out, leaving behind a shell of a man, consumed by paranoia and perverse appetites. History calls him Ibrahim the Mad, but he was also Ibrahim the Terrified. When the dignitaries came to tell him he was now sultan, he barricaded his door, screaming that they had come to kill him. It took his mother, Kösem, coaxing him out like a frightened animal to place the sword of Osman on his waist. She thought she could control him. She thought he would be grateful. She was wrong. Ibrahim's reign descended into a carnival of depravity that makes the excesses of Caligula look tame. The trauma of the cage had warped his mind, turning his fear into a dangerous, unpredictable aggression. He became obsessed with furs, ordering that entire rooms of the palace be lined with sable because he believed it soothed his jagged nerves. He imposed taxes on the empire just to buy perfumes and ambergris to mask the scent of his own anxiety. But his madness turned lethal when it focused on the women of the harem. In a fit of paranoid delusion, whispered into his ear by a rival faction, he became convinced that his entire harem, nearly 300 women, had been corrupted, that they were plotting against him with foreign agents. A sane man investigates. A madman purges. What happened next is one of the darkest stains on the history of the monarchy. A story often whispered by the boatmen of the Bosphorus, but rarely written in the official chronicles. One night, under the cover of a moonless sky, the order was given. The palace guards, the mute executioners, entered the women's quarters. They did not drag the women to the dungeon. They bound them, gagged them, and shoved them into heavy grain sacks weighted with stones. 280 women. Favorites, novices, mothers of potential heirs. It didn't matter. They were loaded onto boats like refuse. They were rowed out into the middle of the dark, swirling currents, where the Bosphorus meets the Sea of Marmara. And one by one, they were pushed overboard. There were no screams, only the heavy splash of the sacks hitting the water. And then, silence. The horror of that night did not end with the dawn. Years later, a diver exploring the depths of the strait for a lost anchor reported a sight that would freeze the blood of any man. He found himself in a forest of the dead. The sacks had not drifted away. The stones held them upright on the seabed. Hundreds of them, swaying gently in the current like a ghastly underwater garden. The forms of the women still visible inside the rotting burlap. This was the reality of Ibrahim's rule. He had turned the Bosphorus into a graveyard. And Kösem, the great Valide Sultan, watched from her window as the boats returned empty. She realized then that the son she had saved from the executioner had become a monster that threatened to devour the entire world. The state was bleeding. The treasury was empty. The people were starving while the Sultan adorned his beard with diamonds. Kösem knew what she had to do. The mother in her had to die, so the queen could do her duty. There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a room when a mother decides her child must die. It is not a peaceful silence. It is the breathless, suffocating vacuum that precedes a catastrophe. In the summer of 1648, that silence filled the audience chamber of Kösem Sultan. The empire was burning. The Janissaries had overturned their soup cauldrons, the traditional sign of rebellion, and were marching on the palace, demanding the head of the mad sultan. The Grand Vizier, the judges, and the religious leaders stood before Kösem, their heads bowed, holding a piece of paper that weighed more than the entire treasury. It was a fatwa, a legal ruling from the Sheikh-ul-Islam, the highest religious authority in the land. The question written on the parchment was simple and devastating. If the caliph of the Muslims loses his reason and endangers the ruin of the state, is it lawful to depose him? The answer, written in a single stroke of black ink, was yes. Kösem stood alone against them for hours. She argued with the ferocity of a lioness protecting her cub. She reminded them of his divine right, of his lineage, of the fact that he was the shadow of God on earth. But the men before her were not moved by rhetoric. They were terrified for their lives. They told her of the empty treasury, the starving mobs, and the Russian fleets gathering in the north. They laid the reality of the situation at her feet. "My sultan," the Grand Vizier whispered, "if you do not sacrifice him, the mob will kill him anyway, and they will kill you, and they will end the dynasty." The logic was cold, ironclad, and inescapable. To save the Ottoman Empire, Ibrahim had to go. To save the tree, the rotten branch had to be severed. And so, the most powerful woman in the world, the woman who had navigated wars and plagues and palace coups, finally met an enemy she could not outwit: necessity. She looked at the men, then she looked at the fatwa. Witnesses say her hands did not tremble, but her face turned the color of ash. She spoke a sentence that should be engraved on her tombstone, a lament of absolute power and absolute helplessness. "I have ruled the world," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But I cannot rule my own son." With those words, she stepped aside. She surrendered him. It was the ultimate act of statecraft and the ultimate betrayal of motherhood. The end came swiftly. Ibrahim was dragged from the throne room, screaming for his mother to save him. He was thrown back into the cage, the very room that had driven him mad in the first place. But this time, there was no food, no water, and no escape. 10 days later, the executioners arrived. They were not strangers. One of them was the chief executioner, a man Ibrahim had known, a man he had once fed from his own table. When they entered the room with the silk bowstring, the former sultan wept. He begged. He asked, "Is there no one among those who ate my bread who will pity me?" But there was no pity in the Topkapi. There was only the law. As the cord tightened around his neck, snuffing out the life of the man she had birthed, Kösem sat in her apartments, listening to the distant commotion. She had done her duty. She had saved the dynasty. But in that empty room, surrounded by the ticking of clocks and the heavy scent of incense, she must have known that she had lost her soul. The Sultanate of Women had reached its zenith, but the price of admission was the blood of her own child. And as the sun set over the Golden Horn, painting the water red, the ghosts of the past began to gather. For Kösem, the story was not over. The violence she had unleashed was about to turn back around and come for her. With the mad sultan buried and the silk cord put away, a 7-year-old boy named Mehmed IV sat on the throne. By all the laws of nature and tradition, this should have been the moment Kösem retired to the old palace, bowing out to let the new sultan's mother take the reins. That mother was Turhan Sultan, a 24-year-old Ukrainian beauty with eyes like cold steel. She expected her turn. She expected the seal of power to be placed in her hands. But Kösem was not ready to let go. She had tasted absolute authority for too long. It was the drug that kept her blood pumping. She invented a new title for herself, Büyük Valide, the great-grandmother. She pushed Turhan aside, treating her like a foolish child, blocking her from the council meetings, and humiliating her in front of the servants. It was a fatal miscalculation. Kösem saw a young girl she could bully. She did not see the wolf hiding in the sheep's clothing. The Topkapi Palace became a battlefield divided by unseen lines. On one side was the grandmother, backed by the Janissary Corps, the soldiers who loved her gold. On the other was the mother, backed by the black eunuchs and the palace bureaucracy. The air in the harem grew heavy with unspoken threats. Food tasters began to die mysteriously. Messages were intercepted. It was a cold war, fought with poisoned needles and whispered rumors. But Kösem, growing impatient and perhaps sensing her own mortality, decided to make the first move. And it was a move so monstrous, it defies belief. She decided that her grandson, the 7-year-old Sultan, was an obstacle. He was too close to his mother. So, she plotted to kill him. Her plan was simple. The Janissaries would invade the palace at night, ostensibly to protect the Sultan. But in the chaos, the boy would be poisoned with a bowl of sweetened sherbet, and his cousin would be placed on the throne, a puppet Kösem could control more easily. It was the perfect coup. It relied on the silence of her inner circle. But in the harem, walls have ears, and loyalty is often rented, not owned. On the night the attack was scheduled, a servant woman named Meliki Hatun, Angel Lady, ironically, betrayed her mistress. Whether out of fear or a sudden pang of conscience, she crept into Turhan's chambers and spilled the entire plot. She told the young mother that the Janissaries were sharpening their swords. She told her that the poison was already prepared. Imagine that moment. Turhan Sultan, holding her sleeping son, hearing that his own grandmother intended to murder him before sunrise. At that moment, fear evaporated, replaced by a primal, murderous rage. Turhan did not flee. She did not hide. She summoned the chief black eunuch, Suleiman Aga, a towering man who despised the Janissaries. She told him, "We strike tonight. It is her life or my son's." The harem was locked down. The heavy bolts were drawn across the imperial gate. But inside, it was a frenzy of activity. The eunuchs, usually the guardians of order, armed themselves. They grabbed whatever they could find, axes from the woodpile, daggers hidden in boots, even heavy iron bars used to secure the doors. They were not soldiers, but they were desperate men fighting for their survival. As the sun set over Istanbul, casting long, blood-red shadows across the courtyards, the tension was so thick it could be tasted. Outside, the Janissaries waited for the signal to storm the gates. Inside, a small army of slaves and eunuchs waited in the dark, gripping their makeshift weapons, their breathing shallow and fast. The most powerful woman in history was asleep in her bed, unaware that the girl she had underestimated had just signed her death warrant. The hunter had become the prey. It began with the shattering of wood. The massive oak doors of the Valide's apartments, which had stood for decades as the barrier between the sacred and the profane, splintered under the blows of axes. The eunuchs poured into the room like a dark tide, their torches casting wild, dancing shadows on the walls. Kösem Sultan, the woman who had made viziers tremble with a raise of her eyebrow, woke to the sound of her own ending. She did not freeze. Even in her 60s, her survival instinct was razor-sharp. She scrambled from her bed, grabbing handfuls of gold coins from a chest, believing, perhaps, that she could still buy her way out of hell, and stuffed them into the pockets of her nightgown. She ran, not to the door, but to a large cabinet built into the wall of the vestibule, squeezing herself into the darkness among the piles of velvet quilts and furs. For a few terrifying moments, the only sound was the heavy breathing of the assassins tearing the room apart, overturning tables, slashing through the silk divans, hunting for the queen. Then, a piece of her dress caught the light. A eunuch spotted the shimmer of fabric protruding from the cabinet door. "Ah!" he shouted. Rough hands reached into the darkness and dragged her out. The indignity of it was absolute. The great Valide, the regent of the empire, was hauled across the floor of her own bedroom like a common criminal. She fought them. She screamed, "I am the Valide Sultan! Do you dare touch me?" But the men holding her were beyond fear. They were fueled by the bloodlust of a coup. One of them, a man named Kushchu Mehmed, ripped the diamond earrings from her ears with such force that her lobes tore open, the blood streaming down her neck to stain her white nightgown. The coins she had hidden spilled from her pockets, rolling across the floor, ignored by men who were there for a prize far more valuable than gold. They were there for her life. They dragged her towards the Kushane gate, the corridor leading to the kitchens. It was a messy, chaotic brawl. There was no dignity in this death. There was no executioner with a silk bowstring waiting to do it cleanly. They tried to strangle her with their bare hands, but she fought back with a strength that shocked them, biting and clawing. Finally, in a panic, someone grabbed a thick cord hanging from the velvet curtains, the very curtains she had once used to shield herself from the eyes of men while she ruled the world. They twisted the cord around her neck. Kushchu Mehmed placed his heavy boot on her back to gain leverage, and he pulled. The struggle lasted for agonizing minutes. She gasped, her eyes wide, staring at the ceiling of the palace she had virtually built. And then, the fighting stopped. The body that had borne sultans went limp. The silence that followed was heavier than the violence. The assassins stood back, panting, looking down at the twisted heap of silk and blood that lay on the marble. It was done. The Naibi Sultanate was dead. They dragged her body outside and left it in the snow of the courtyard, stripped of its jewels, abandoned like the carcass of an animal. It is said that when the sun rose, the common people of Istanbul wept, for she had been their benefactor, their mother. But inside the harem, there were no tears. Turhan Sultan had won. The era of the great Valide was over, ended not by a foreign army or a natural disaster, but by a length of drapery cord and the ruthless ambition of a daughter-in-law who had learned her lessons too well. The floor was scrubbed, the blood washed away, but the stain on the history of the Ottoman dynasty would remain forever. The Sultanate of Women had begun with a wedding. It ended with a butchery. The blood was washed from the marble floors of the Topkapi before noon. The body of Kösem Sultan was buried in the mausoleum of her husband, her name whispered now only in fear. But while flesh decays and bone turns to dust, paper has a way of surviving. And if we want to truly understand the scope of the Sultanate of Women, we must turn our eyes away from the scene of the murder and look at the evidence locked away in the archives of Venice, Paris, and London. It is here, in the cool, dry air of European libraries that we find the true autopsy of their power. We find it in the bundles of letters written on thick, glazed paper, smelling faintly of centuries-old musk. These documents prove that the harem was not a sealed tomb. It was a nerve center, connected to the world by a secret, sophisticated network of agents, known as the Kiras. The Valide sultans were prisoners in their own palace. They could not step foot in a market, board a ship, or speak directly to a foreign ambassador. By law, they were invisible. So how did Nurbanu negotiate peace treaties with Venice? How did Safiye discuss naval strategy with Queen Elizabeth? They used a loophole. They used the Kiras. These were non-Muslim women, mostly Jewish widows, who were permitted to enter the harem to sell fabrics and jewelry. To the guards at the gates, they were harmless peddlers carrying bundles of silk. But inside those bundles, hidden between layers of brocade, were diplomatic dispatches that would change the map of Europe. Women like Esther Handali and Esperanza Malchi were not mere merchants. They were the fiber-optic cables of the 16th century. They carried the whispers of the Valide Sultan to the ears of foreign kings. We have the receipts. In the British Library, there sits a letter from Safiye Sultan to Queen Elizabeth. It is not the scribbling of a secluded housewife. It is a masterpiece of diplomatic protocol. It is written in a confident, flowing Ottoman script, dusted with gold sand to prevent the ink from smearing, a display of immense wealth. In it, she addresses the English queen not as a superior, nor even as a distant ruler, but as a sister. She discusses the exchange of prisoners, the tariffs on English wool, and the movement of the Spanish Armada. She writes with the cool authority of a woman who knows exactly where the warships are docked. This single piece of paper destroys the myth of the ignorant harem girl. It is forensic proof that while the Sultan may have been the face of the empire, the Valide was often its brain. But this network came with a terrible risk. The Kiras became immensely powerful and immensely hated. They were the gatekeepers. If you wanted a favor from the Valide, you had to bribe the Kira first. And when the anger of the soldiers boiled over, these intermediaries were often the first to bleed. In 1600, the Sipahi cavalry rebelled against the corruption of the court. They didn't storm the harem. They found Esperanza Malchi. They dragged her into the street and butchered her in front of a cheering crowd. When they realized who she was, they didn't stop. They cut her into pieces. And here is the chilling detail recorded by historians. The soldiers did not loot her house for gold. They looted it for secrets. They knew that inside her ledgers lay the true accounting of the empire. Who had paid a bribe, who had sold an office, and exactly how much the Queen Mother was skimming off the top. The death of the Kira was a warning shot, fired directly at the heart of the harem. It was a signal that the invisible walls protecting the Valide Sultan were beginning to crack, and that the secrets they had trafficked in were becoming too dangerous to keep. But secrets were not the only thing being hoarded in the Topkapi. If we look at the ledgers of the Ottoman treasury during this period, we see a terrifying graph. As the power of the Valide Sultans rose, the value of the Ottoman currency, the akçe, plummeted. It is a direct correlation that historians have debated for centuries. To fund their immense networks of patronage, to pay the bribes that kept their sons on the throne, and to build the magnificent mosques that still define the skyline of Istanbul today, the women of the harem needed cash. And when the taxes from Egypt and the Balkans were not enough, they resorted to a dangerous trick: debasement. They ordered the mints to mix copper with the silver. They ordered the edges of the coins to be clipped, literally shaving off the wealth of the empire, sliver by sliver. Imagine being a Janissary soldier stationed on the cold frontier of Hungary. You have marched for months. You have bled for the Sultan, and when payday arrives, the paymaster hands you a pouch of coins that feel too light. You bite down on one, and it bends. It is light money, zuyuf akçe. It buys half the bread it did a year ago. But then, news arrives from the capital. The Valide Sultan has just commissioned a new pair of golden candlesticks for the holy shrine in Mecca, studded with diamonds the size of pigeons' eggs. She is building the Yeni Valide Mosque, a construction project so massive it is swallowing entire neighborhoods. The contrast was not just unfair, it was incendiary. The soldiers looked at their worthless coins, and then they looked at the gilded carriage of the Queen Mother, and they realized who was eating their lunch. This financial toxicity created a cycle of violence that shook the empire to its core. The Janissaries did not just grumble, they overturned their soup cauldrons. In the language of the Ottoman court, this was the ultimate symbol of mutiny. It meant, we will no longer eat the Sultan's soup. It meant death was coming. And who did they blame? They did not blame the Sultan. He was sacred, the shadow of God. They blamed the witches who whispered in his ear. They blamed the women. It is easy to see why the misogynistic historians of the time, and many since, labeled this era the reign of the whores. They pointed to the empty treasury and the rebellious army and said, "Look, this is what happens when you let women rule." They painted the Valide sultans as parasites, sucking the lifeblood out of the state to feed their own vanity. But before we accept this verdict and close the case file, there is one final piece of evidence we must examine. One twist that changes everything. Because if these women were truly the villains destroying the empire, why didn't it collapse? Here is the twist that the history books written by men often forget to mention. The Sultanate of Women did not destroy the Ottoman Empire. In fact, it is the only reason the empire survived at all. Look at the lineup of sultans these women were propping up. Selim was a chronic alcoholic who couldn't stand up straight. Mustafa was mentally disabled, a gentle soul who threw coins to the fish in the Bosphorus while his viziers robbed the state. Osman was a teenager who was murdered by his own troops. Ibrahim was a raving madman who wanted to kill his own children. And Mehmet was a 7-year-old boy. This was a dynasty in free fall. It was a genetic and political catastrophe. By all logic, the Ottoman Empire should have fractured into a dozen warring states in the year 1600. The Persians were pushing from the east, the Habsburgs from the west, and the throne was occupied by a vacuum. So who filled that vacuum? Who read the diplomatic cables when the Sultan was too drunk to focus? Who met with the generals when the Sultan was hiding under his bed? It was Nurbanu. It was Safiye. It was Kösem. They were not parasites. They were the life support system. They were the regents who stepped into the breach when the patriarchy collapsed under the weight of its own incompetence. When Kösem Sultan stood behind that curtain, she wasn't usurping power. She was doing the job that her son was incapable of doing. She was the crisis manager of the 17th century. They held the state together with sheer willpower, bribery, and blood. They maintained the illusion of a functioning monarchy so that the enemies at the gates wouldn't realize the throne was empty. Yes, they were ruthless. Yes, they stole. Yes, they killed. But they were operating in a system that gave them no other tools. They were women trying to steer a sinking ship while locked in the cargo hold. The tragedy is not that they ruined the empire. The tragedy is that they were the only ones capable of saving it. And for that, they were demonized. They were forced to become monsters because the men who were supposed to be gods had failed. The Sultanate of Women was not a period of female decadence. It was a century-long, desperate measure to keep the Ottoman star from falling out of the sky. And for 100 years, it worked. But every storm must eventually run out of rain. The end of the Sultanate of Women did not come with another murder, but with a moment of quiet, stunning humility. Turhan Sultan, the young woman who had stepped over Kösem's body to seize the regency, found herself standing at the helm of a ship that was still sinking. She had the power she had killed for, but she also had the wisdom to see the truth. She could not fix this alone. The empire was too broken. The venality was too deep. And so, in 1656, 5 years after the bloodbath in the harem, Turhan Sultan did something revolutionary. She did something no Valide Sultan before her had ever dared to do. She willingly gave up her power. She found a man named Köprülü Mehmed Pasha. He was an old man, nearly 80, illiterate but ferocious, known for his honesty and his cruelty. Turhan summoned him to the palace. In a room lined with the ghosts of the past, she handed him the imperial seal. She gave him absolute authority to rule, to execute, to purge the corruption without interference, even from her. It was the ultimate sacrifice. To save her son's throne, she agreed to step back into the shadows. She agreed to become just a mother again. With that single act, the era of the great female regents came to a close. The heavy doors of the harem swung shut, locking the women away from the council chambers once more. The music stopped. The golden carriages were put away. The kingdom of the mothers faded into the pages of history, leaving behind only the echo of their ambition and the stain of their crimes. The corridors of the Topkapi Palace are quiet now. The tiles that once rang with the laughter of Nurbanu, the commands of Safiye, and the screams of Kösem are silent. Tourists walk through these rooms today, snapping photos of the beautiful mosaics, unaware of the fierce intelligence that once burned within these walls. They see the jewelry in the museum cases, the emerald daggers, the diamond spoons, and they see pretty objects. They do not see the weapons. They do not see the price paid for every carat. The Sultanate of Women was a time of fire and blood, a time when women were forced to be harder than stone to survive in a world of glass. They were the unsung titans of the Ottoman story, the ones who held the roof up while the pillars were crumbling. And as the sun sets over the Golden Horn today, if you listen closely to the wind whistling through the cypress trees, you might just hear them, not weeping, not apologizing, but whispering the one truth they all knew. Power is not given. It is taken. It is easy to leave them there, locked behind the heavy iron gates of the past, safe in the belief that their world was a barbaric anomaly that has nothing to do with us. We tell ourselves that we have evolved. We tell ourselves that the days of fratricide and poisoned sherbet are over. But look closer. Look at the world around you today. The tools have changed, yes. The silk bowstring has been replaced by the lawsuit, the press leak, the frozen bank account. But the instinct? The instinct remains exactly the same. We still see the tiger mothers who will destroy anyone standing in the way of their child's success. We still see the political dynasties where family loyalty is the only currency that matters, and where betrayal is punished with social exile. The Valide Sultans are not dead. They have simply changed their clothes. They are the CEOs, ensuring their sons inherit the boardroom. They are the politicians, protecting their daughters from scandal. They are every parent who has ever looked at their child and thought, I would burn the world down to keep you safe. The story of the Sultanate of Women is not just a history lesson. It is a dark mirror. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that love, in its most extreme form, is not always a force for good. It can be a weapon. It can be a justification for the horrific. When Nurbanu sat with a corpse in the ice, when Safiye counted her gold while the city starved, when Kösem signed the death warrant for her own son, they were not acting out of malice. They were acting out of a terrifying, distorted love. They were proving that the female instinct to nurture and the human instinct to dominate are not opposites. Sometimes, they are the exact same thing. They remind us that the hand that rocks the cradle is also the hand that can crush the throat of an empire. And now, the final seal is yours to break. You have walked with me through the freezing courtyards of 1595. You have seen the 19 small coffins leaving the palace in the mist. You have heard the dripping of the ice in Selim's death chamber and the tearing of the curtain cord in Kösem's bedroom. You have held the evidence in your hands, the letters dusted with gold, the ledgers balanced with blood. So, I ask you for your verdict. When you close your eyes tonight, what do you see? Do you see monsters who usurped the natural order for their own vanity? Or do you see the ultimate survivors? Women who were thrown into a pit of vipers and managed to become the kings of the snakes. Were they the villains of the story? Or were they the only heroes the Ottoman Empire had left? The history books have already judged them. They called them witches. They called them whores. But you know better now. You know that in the Game of Thrones, there is no morality, only survival. So, do not look away. Do not pretend you didn't hear the silence of the Bosphorus. Carry their ghosts with you. And if you dare to uncover more secrets that history has tried to bury, if you want to walk further into the dark with me, then make your pledge now. Subscribe to BBM Historical Review. Turn on the notifications, because the crypt is vast, and we have only just opened the first door. I am your guide through the shadows. The next story is already waiting, and I promise you, it is even darker than this one.